So you had sent me a video. It seemed to be a collaboration between After School and the Academy of Ideas, and it was titled Mass Psychosis, How an Entire Population Becomes Mentally Ill. And I think it'll be good to throw in a few of these clips as a quick montage to contextualize this conversation a bit.
The masses have never thirsted after truth. They turn aside from evidence that is not to their taste, preferring to deify error if error seduce them. Whoever can supply them with illusions is easily their master. Whoever attempts to destroy their illusions is always their victim. According to the psychologist Carl Jung, the greatest threat to civilization lies not with the forces of nature, nor with any physical disease, but with our inability to deal with the forces of our own psyche. We are our own worst enemies, or as the Latin proverb puts it, man is a wolf to man. In Civilization in Transition, Jung states that this proverb is a sad yet eternal truism, and our wolf-like tendencies come most prominently into play at those times of history when mental illness becomes the norm rather than the exception in a society, a situation which Jung termed a psychic epidemic. Indeed, it is becoming ever more obvious, he writes, that it is not famine, not earthquakes, not microbes, not cancer, but man himself, who is man's greatest danger to man, for the simple reason that there is no adequate protection against psychic epidemics, which are infinitely more devastating than the worst of natural catastrophes. In this video, we are going to explore the most dangerous of all psychic epidemics, the mass psychosis. A mass psychosis is an epidemic of madness, and it occurs when a large portion of a society loses touch with reality and descends into delusions. What makes matters worse is that those suffering from a mass psychosis are unaware of what is occurring. For just as an individual gone mad cannot step out of his mind to observe the errors in his ways, so too there is no Archimedean point from which those living through a mass psychosis can observe their collective madness. But what causes a mass psychosis? To answer this question, we must first explore what drives an individual mad. While there are many potential triggers of madness, such as an excessive use of drugs or alcohol, brain injuries, and other illnesses, these physical causes will not concern us here. Our concern is with psychological, or what are called psychogenic triggers, as these are the most common culprits of the mass psychosis. The most prevalent psychogenic cause of a psychosis is a flood of negative emotions, such as fear or anxiety, that drives an individual into a state of panic. When in a state of panic, an individual will naturally seek relief, as it is too mentally and physically draining to subsist in this hyper-emotional state. While escaping from the state of panic can be accomplished through adaptive means, such as facing up to and defeating the fear-generating threat, another way to escape is to undergo a psychotic break. A psychotic break is not a descent into a state of greater disorder, as many believe, but a reordering of one's experiential world, which blends fact and fiction, or delusions and reality, in a way that helps end the feelings of panic. If a panic-triggering flood of negative emotions in a weak and vulnerable individual can trigger a psychotic break, then a mass psychosis can result when a population of weak and vulnerable individuals is driven into a state of panic by threats real, imagined, or fabricated. But as delusions can take many forms, and as madness can manifest in countless ways, the specific manner in which a mass psychosis unfolds will differ based on the historical and cultural context of the infected society. But in the modern era, it is the mass psychosis of totalitarianism that appears to be the greatest threat. Totalitarianism, writes Arthur Versluis, is the modern phenomenon of total centralized state power, coupled with the obliteration of individual human rights. In the totalized state, there are those in power, and there are the objectified masses, the victims. In a totalitarian society, the population is divided into two groups, the rulers and the ruled, and both groups undergo a pathological transformation. The rulers are elevated to an almost godlike status, which is diametrically opposed to our nature as imperfect beings who are easily corrupted by power. The masses, on the other hand, are transformed into the dependent subjects of these pathological rulers and take on a psychologically regressed and childlike status.
So here right now, with everything going on with the pandemic, I think a lot of people feel like there's a great deal of uncertainty, great deal of fear, and that almost like we're not recognizing what's going on in our society. There's some of us feel there's like a mass psychosis or a mass, some mental challenge going on with people. I can't imagine why would they not want to get vaccinated and help people. There must be something psychologically wrong with people. On the flip side, the unvaccinated people, I can't believe these people would want to take this experimental situation. Don't they see that the numbers are not that high, right? There's arguments on both sides, and I think we should talk about this a little bit with regards to this mass psychosis. You brought this up to me the other day. Tell me, what have you been feeling with regards to this?
Well, I mean, I think it's the product of a year and a half, right? I don't think you come to any of these sort of conclusions or perspectives out of the gate. I mean, they evolve as a situation that's as surreal as this situation evolves. And again, depending on your conditioning, where you were brought up, where you grew up, what your genetics are, everybody comes to this with that, right? Everybody forgets that we're all the product of our conditioning and our programming, whatever that is. And most of how we view this particular situation comes from that, period. I mean, and that unfortunately is the part of us that, you'd refer to as the subconscious or the unconscious, right? Obviously, you talk a lot about consciousness, and I think people have kind of lost sight at times of what that means, right? It really means some sort of jarred awakening out of whatever automatic pilot you've been on your whole life.
Yeah.
If you're lucky enough to have that very difficult, very challenging experience, you have the opportunity for a second half of life that is in lesser part dictated by your programming and more part of actual conscious thought and examining things with less bias, less emotion, less conditioned subjectivity, etc. Well, now that's hard enough to do in the best of times. When you're talking about a time of incredibly high level stakes, amplified fear, well, we know historically that unfortunately is what brings out the worst in people. And when you study history and you look at, some of the atrocities that, going back to the 20th century and beyond, groupthink, mass hysteria, mass psychosis is almost always, upon reflection, the key contributor to what happened. And unfortunately, it's never something that people, let's say during the Salem witch trial, nobody was going to go, do you think this is too much? Like, no, you are caught up subconsciously in a psychological state of trauma where your safety feels compromised. And so you target, right? And in this particular case, you targeted the women who you would label as witches, and we know how it went. But there's tons of examples throughout history where that happened. It was a result of first disorder being introduced into the everyday, a fear, an outside threat that created a mass panic. And the way our societies have always been ruled, even in the post-monarchy societies of the last 250, 300 years, we forget the relationship between the state and the people, the ruled and the ruler, is still very much the parent and the kid, right? And it's easy to forget that, and people would probably scoff if they were reminded of that during normal times. No, that's not true. I don't, whatever. But man, oh man, when things are turned up in terms of the heat of a certain potential threat or risk, regardless of how infinitesimal it might be, we see in an instant almost regular, everyday, normal people, for lack of a better way to say it, become, in some cases, unrecognizable, because that fear, that wiring in us that our safety, our survival is somehow potentially at risk is the most predominant human instinct there is. And you want to get back to feeling safe. That's all you think about. Every single thing you will do. And this, there's been plenty of psychological, sociological, anthropological studies on this. It's not breaking news. But until you're in it, and until you're in a situation that really shakes you up in a way that maybe you've never experienced, it's harder to see. Yeah. But what you want ultimately when you're in that, when you're feeling those negative feelings that creates this mass psychosis, is you want somebody to tell you it's going to be okay.
Yeah. Like
your parents. That's it, man. And again, plenty of empirical data and studies throughout history, go over this exhaustively. And again and again and again, we seem to default to that behavior. Well, this is no different. Whatever your predilection is, whether it's you're more suspicious of the state and government and believe that there's nefarious purposes going on behind the scenes, or you're somebody who completely believes that everything you see and experience every day is all there is, and that, if you stop at red lights and go at green lights and do what you're told, that everything's going to be okay, regardless of where you end up on that spectrum. A situation like the one we're in will trigger psychogenesis triggers, as they're called in the video that we were referring to, psychogenic triggers. Well, that's going to be essentially a mass psychosis on either end of the spectrum. If you're super suspicious of what could be going on, you're going to be almost unable to be able to think about anything else going on. Everything that is going to be presented to you is going to feel like a massive threat to your sovereignty, to your future, whatever it might be. Conversely, if you're incredibly terrified about COVID, for instance, that is going to amplify beyond what could be reasonably considered proportionate reaction. And in a certain segment of the population, it's going to manifest in hysteria, in a wildly disproportionate reaction. But unfortunately, the people who are running things always know that that is ultimately the most suggestible time for people. And if you believe that what you're doing is right, then the end justifies the means, right? That's you go back and look at all those historical atrocities that we were talking about earlier. Every single one of them, none of them were perpetrated by people who were sitting in a room going, ha, 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 we are evil. That's for children. That's for movies and stuff and, old comic books. The truth of the matter is anybody that's ever perpetrated evil in this world, with very few exceptions, have always convinced themselves that they were working on behalf of the greater good, and therefore the end justifies the means. So when we enter a period like this, Joe, it's very dangerous because you can have people who work at media institutions, and again, I've talked to these people, where they're being told or deciding on their own not to report certain things and to create hit pieces. And again, that's just to be clear. I know that's happening. Yeah. I'm being told that that's happening, that certain groups are being attacked. Again, not because they're not saying it like, wow, like we know we're doing bad. No, they believe it's look, if you're fighting for what's right, you have to do whatever is necessary to accomplish the goals. And ultimately, if it has to mean that you're going to get down in the gutter to fight dirty because the end justifies the means, then you're going to be able to do that. And you're not necessarily going to have to be convinced to do that. You'll choose to do it.
Yeah. And, dealing with a lot of this stuff, a lot of people will say, what's going on out there, what we're seeing in terms of this threat, in terms of this pandemic, I mean, the science is clear, right? And we might see this from all across the spectrum. The science is clear, like, this is a huge threat. This is a huge problem. The facts are the facts. Yet, as we discussed even in previously, we were talking, but this is not an issue of facts. This is not an issue of what exactly the data says. This is an issue of human condition in a sense. And so it leads to the question of, if we could say that in order to get to the logic, something has to happen within us first, how do we start exploring that? How do we start getting there as people when we're in this state from what your perspective is?
Well, again, it's hard to do in the best of times. It's incredibly difficult to do when you're, the hamster is going at 100 miles an hour all day, every day, because of all the chemicals in your body are reacting to the fear that you're feeling. That's as tough a task as anybody can be asked to take on. However, I don't believe there is any other quote unquote solution. It does require people themselves to lead by example, to really meditate on compassion, on empathy, on conviction, intuition, and really do, the work that's required to be as healthy mentally, physically, and spiritually as you could possibly be. It's only a consciousness shift that's going to ultimately, turn this battleship in the bathtub around. And that's not going to happen by just telling people they're wrong, telling people you're right. It's got to be something metaphysical, I believe, that's happens at a great enough clip that it becomes contagious, viral, if you will.
Yeah, because what's essentially happening is those in positions of power, the authority, are taking the science that they want to put forth. It's being put forth, and it's being used to create that mass hysteria on the masses. And then when there's other people that are saying, "Hey guys, hold on a second," there are other scientists that are having different perspectives. We start to see the symptom of that mass hysteria within the masses, where they're saying, well, I can't trust that other scientist because all these authorities already agree, right? They already know, they've already told me that all these people must just be anti this or anti that. And I think that's the part of this that is so tricky, is communicating. And when you were alluding to, the idea that we have to kind of do this work, we need to start to learn how to connect and how to learn to get in within ourselves. This is because it seems like the only way forward is to actually be able to speak with someone who we disagree with, right? We can't go anywhere as a single person unless you see a breakaway civilization pop up, right? We kind of need to all get on the same page, and it seems like the only way to do that is to learn to be enough within ourselves that we can actually communicate.
Well, the divide and conquer thing, might be culminating here in its greatest heights, right? Because it's been the historical methodology for creating the world that we have today. And now, as you find yourself in the, as people are often saying, the most divisive time ever, where it's younger versus older, it's men against women, it's black versus white, it's gay versus straight, it's liberal versus conservative. At every single possible juncture, you find division, where, to your point, anybody that would think about this logically would realize, well, are we trying to convince ourselves that it's possible to have a completely monolithic society? Are we under the impression that at some point, absolutely everyone is going to feel the same way, have the same worldview? Well, we know by definition the diversity that we're so fond of talking about these days would dictate that, quite obviously, that's not the case. That as many people as there are on this planet, there are different perspectives, different conditioning, different programming, different life experience. Yet we seem to be operating as though there could be consensus, again, scientific consensus, that any right-minded person would see it the way I see it. Well, obviously, that's ego. It's infantile level ego, actually, because any objective adult would obviously know what I'm saying right now is true. You're always going to have a myriad of different perspectives and opinions on anything. If anything's been more revealed through the era of social media. You could post something right now, Joe, that's pro-oxygen, and you're still going to have well, I'm not, that's the truth.
Yeah.
And if you're not designing systems that take that into account and figure out, well, how are we going to be able to have this diversity of opinion and perspective, and be able to also coexist? That's not driving any political perspectives right now. It's how am I going to convert everybody else to how I see things? And what we see at a period right now where you have, this heightened level of fear is that you have on top of it, for instance, you have isolation, right? So what did Pavlov discover in his experiments that's not as talked about as just the Pavlovian response of the salivating dog, is that the training and the conditioning of the dog was infinitely easier when the dog was isolated away from everything else, right?
Yeah.
So this is something we understand about human beings, is if they're isolated for an extended period of time and are feeling negative emotions on top of it, fear being the most impactful, well, they are ready to, all they want is to return back to what was, and it doesn't even have to be good. It just has to be familiar.
Yeah.
Just normal. It just has to go back to me not feeling uneasy and chaotic internally because this does not jive with how things are normally. Well, obviously, if you're in a situation where, again, you believe you're doing the right thing and it's necessary to get everybody on side, well, then obviously all the means of manipulation that have never been more ubiquitous are at your disposal to do whatever it is that you see fit to achieve the end goal. Again, the end justifies the means. And without some degree of compassion and empathy, first, I mean, I would even say from people who might not necessarily agree with the establishment, you still see a lot of people like angry, understandably. They feel threatened and traumatized. They can see the writing on the wall.
Yeah.
But it requires at this particular time, again, what Václav Havel called parallel, like creating a parallel like option, parallel structures, parallel structures, meaning essentially what you were talking about before. It's not going to happen through trying to penetrate a mass psychosis in real time. There's no historical example of that happening. In real time, it is different. Like, again, a switch has been turned on. It's only after the fact that you see people, upon reflection, 5 years, 10 years, 50 years after, seeing it from a more neutral perspective and going, wow, I don't know what happened to me. I was just overcome. I don't know. So how do you potentially create solutions? Well, again, you have to walk the walk. You have to lead by example and be a compassionate, loving, empathetic person if you expect anyone to listen to you. But B, at a collective level, I think we're going to start to see these parallel structures, these communities pop up that hopefully can demonstrate the alternative to what we're seeing right now. But it's not something that's easy to do, because right now, unless we're going to all go in the bush and start, building a commune, and whose land is that? There's a whole, but I believe necessity is the mother of all invention, as they say, and I think we're going to see that. But right now, what we're in right now, again, it's not a facts problem. It's not an argument, a debate. It's a psychological and sociological issue that, unless we're taking that into account and having that inform our action, then we're just really we're part of the problem, not part of the solution.